really a pleasure to have you all here today. So I welcome you to the library. I don't have a prepared speech or anything. I know that you don't like that, so I'm going to do it. It's really a pleasure to be able to celebrate the founder of the university. We have heard so many stories when we were establishing the university exhibition, the archives, many stories about Dr. Keuper and his strengths and his eccentric way of doing things and his determination. And it really takes an unusual person to think about building a university. It's not something that you do like building an office or a practice, but building a university against all odds with the least amount of money, and then 6 years later you are still here. It does take a very unusual person. So we're really thankful to him for having to do this. Without him, I won't have this job. Or President Catanese wouldn't have this job. So we are having, I'm very pleased to have President Catanese here. So with our founder president and our current president, we have a good long time of history and issue as things to celebrate. I just want to thank you all for coming. I would especially thank Melanie Keuper for being here, Dr. Keuper's granddaughter, and there are some fun stories that you will be hearing about. Dr. Harry Weber, who's our archives is named after him, and now Dr. Gordon, who will be speaking about Dr. Keuper shortly. But before Gordon would begin to speak, I'd like to introduce Dr. Frank, who is our main speaker today. Dr. Frank has been working at FIT since 1974, or came to FIT since 1974, and by the time he retired, he was Vice Provost for Academic Affairs. He has had a long history of the institution, has been one of its mainstay and one of the researchers with a great deal of funding, over $3.5 million in research opportunities, as well numerous publications, book chapters, and many academic achievements. I would like to introduce now Dr. Frank.
Thank you all for coming tonight. She mentioned that I came here in 1974. Shortly after I got here, several years after I got here, I got a call from the dean's office asking me to come in. And I was informed then that my boss, the department head, had left the university suddenly, and I was going to be the acting department head. And the reason I tell you this is because at that moment I became officially an administrator. And about that same time, President Keuper then had a reception at his home for academic administrators. And so here I was, a relatively young faculty member, going out to the president's home for his reception. And there are a couple of things I remember that I just wanted to share with you about that time. One is, after we were there for a while and it started getting dark, President Keuper herded us all out into the backyard, and this overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. He lived in Melbourne Beach, and he set off fireworks and skyrockets. And I thought that was kind of interesting, and I got to thinking that maybe that's kind of how he thought, you know. And as I learned in the subsequent years, yeah, he did a lot of thinking like skyrockets. So I remember that, but the other thing I remember even more is he asked a few of us who had never been to his home before if we wanted to see his workshop. Now, we all knew that he had restored MGs, the little sports cars, and that he loved to do that, and so we assumed, yeah, you're going to have a workshop in order to do that. So I assumed we'd go out to the garage, or maybe he had a standalone workshop out in the yard someplace. But no, now this is in Melbourne Beach. We went downstairs into the basement, and that's where his workshop was. It was a full basement below his house. And I remember seeing the workbench there. It had a crankshaft on it from some form of MG. And I had lived in Florida just long enough to know that people here didn't have basements. And so I asked him about that. I said, did you have any problem building this home with this basement? He says, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did. He said, when I submitted the plan for the basement, the planning guy looked at it and started shaking his head. Had the book in front of him of the codes and went through and tried to find the code that dealt with basements. And President Keuper said, finally, you know, the permitting guy looked at him and said, there's nothing here anywhere about basements. Nobody builds basements here. I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to have a basement. So I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, we don't have a basement. He said, if you look on the original building permit, you will find that the Keuper house doesn't have a basement. It has an enlarged crawl space. And I remember thinking at the time, yes, this is someone who thinks outside the box. Very definitely someone who thinks outside the box. And so those are my early memories of President Keuper, one of the first times that I had a chance to interact with him. Our main speaker tonight is a university historian, and he has done a lot of work dealing with the history of FIT in addition to a lot of his other interests. He authored a book a while ago on the history of FIT, and I just wanted to read a couple sentences in the introduction. He says, there is something magical about this university. Florida Tech radiates a kind of energy and vision, passion and intensity. Florida Tech has made a tradition of confounding skeptics and realizing its dreams. And I think all of us who have worked here would absolutely agree with that. Our speaker, Dr. Patterson, came to FIT in 1981. And he has accumulated a lot of awards and has published a lot of papers and books, including this one. And so I'm trying to figure out what I should say about him tonight. That there's one award that he won that I think is really very telling. About 20 years ago, the university decided to create an MVP award. The MVP award was Most Valuable Panther. And this was to be given out monthly, and nominations were to come in from the university as a whole. Faculty, staff, administration, anybody who worked at the university could submit a nomination. This then went to a committee who reviewed these. The committee was made up of people from all over the university also. And they realized that in order for this award to be meaningful and seem valid, the first recipient of this had to be a very, very special person. And I think Kathy was wonderful enough to resurrect this plaque. This plaque says up at the top, Most Valuable Panther, and at least for a while, they put the names of the people on here who were the most valuable Panthers. And in the upper left-hand corner is the very first person, that very perfect person, the all-important person that they picked, Dr. Gordon Patterson, October 1996. So 20 years ago, Gordon was the most valuable Panther, and he's been that every year since then. And it is my extreme pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Gordon Patterson.
Thank you, Bob. I'll begin with a story that I hadn't planned to tell, but early in my career, I was invited by a group of fraternity members to take part in a homecoming parade shortly before President Keuper retired. And they had a 1964 Oldsmobile convertible. And we organized around the Ruffner Park. And there was at that time in Melbourne a zoo, but not our zoo, it was a little zoo out on 192 that had the distinction in Parade magazine of being one of America's 10 worst zoos. And so I had read that, and I arrived to ride in the car as I think I was Grand Marshal or something of that sort. And there was a large black panther, actually it was a leopard, in the back. It was toothless. They'd gotten it at Mr. Hoozer's. And they said, you're going to ride with the panther. But you'll have to have this chain because it's been chained all of its life. So they hooked a chain up to me. We got in the back of the car. And we proceeded down Country Club. And in the kind of intrepid way that only a foolish historian can show, by the time we got to Roberts Hall, I'd made friends with it. And I must say that this animal purred like an Evinrude motor. It had no teeth and so. And then the first aero student with the air horn came out and blew the air horn. And if any of you recall, there's that Bruder film of the Kennedy assassination of Mrs. Kennedy on the back. That was very much, the panther was on my back at one point, and I was on his. I found myself holding the panther and it was shivering. And then the second air horn was even more bracing. And I remember afterwards thinking to myself, only at Florida Institute of Technology does one get the chance to work for a guy that's got a basement that shoots skyrockets off and gives you the chance to ride with a panther. 58 years ago, a station wagon pulling a 1952 MG with a little baby girl in it was driving from the northeast to Florida. 2 days later, it arrived at the Florida border, someplace a little after 10:48 in the evening, when General John Medeiros announced that America had launched our first satellite, Explorer 1. And in that moment of launching that satellite, a kind of cascade of changes were taking place in America. 3 months earlier, on the 4th of October, Sputnik was launched. And as a little boy, I recall on cold October nights in the Ozarks, looking up and wondering if I could see that thing. And what was happening, I think, in that period was the beginning of a series of changes that would see centuries of racial injustice change, centuries in which women did not have opportunities to go to universities, to find careers, and changes in the very character of our country. And what happened on that day, when that car, that MJ came to Florida, was a process that led to the creation of this university. What I'd like to do this evening is talk a little bit about how those changes and those opportunities still continue to affect us 58 years after that arrival. Jerry Keuper was a remarkable man. I knew him best after President Keuper had retired. But early on in my career, I remember the first phone call that I got from President Keuper. Charlie Corman, who was the founder of our psychology program, once told me the story, and it happened. Oftentimes, President Keuper would address a faculty member, he wants me, say, "Hey, pal, how are you doing?" And then John Miller, who was a great figure, said, "You know, the reason he calls you pal is he doesn't know your name." But finally, on one occasion, about 10 o'clock at night, I heard this phone ring, and I hear this, "Gordon, it's Jerry Keuper. I need something." And at that point, I realized that in my place at this university, the veil of anonymity had somehow been cast off. I was no longer pal, but he knew my name, and more importantly, he knew my phone number. Jerry Keuper's story is an interesting one. His great-grandfather was born in Prussia in 1816. His name was Joseph Keuper, I believe. immigrated to the United States sometime after 1848, the year of Revolution. Went to Kentucky. And there the Keupers began to live their lives, doing all sorts of things. Jerry Keuper's father started was the owner of a hardware store, C.J.'s Hardware Store. And in fact, here's a revelation for you. Some of you don't know. His name really wasn't Jerry Keuper. There's a document that Melanie showed me. His name was Clarence, and he changed his name. And we have a document signed by Ray Work to make it Jerry Penn Keuper. And I asked him once, why did you choose Penn? And he said, because I like the name Penn. And that's a good reason. So in that sense, Jerry Keuper is born in 1921, 95 years ago. He's born in a little town called Fort Thomas, Kentucky. That's 4 miles from Cincinnati. There's a little 4-mile railroad that connected Cincinnati with Fort Thomas. He had a childhood friend that lived not very far from him named Jim Stoms. Jim Stoms and Jerry Keuper would be chums their entire life. They went to a high school called Highland High School. And I found some pictures when I was looking at one point about things about them. This high school was a very, very interesting place. Jerry Keuper was known for being, at least the Cincinnati Enquirer has a front page picture of him doing the Big Apple in a 1938 dance in which he's described as a man who is very good on his feet. He's in a fraternity in which he's described as a ladies' man. He and Jim go off to Eastern Kentucky State Teachers College. And there they're involved in all sorts of things. The Rifle Club, the Mathematics Club. They're involved in, well, at least Jerry Keuper is, ROTC. And in 1943, still as an undergraduate, hadn't finished, he's called active duty and goes off to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And there, his sharpness, his quickness, got him advanced into officers' candidacy school, and he makes this transition into the OSS and ends up in Burma, and finally over the hump into China, where he develops a lifelong interest in Chinese. And the last book that he wrote, of course, was an idiomatic dictionary of Chinese, which is a remarkable testament to his ability to turn a phrase in lots of different languages. He comes back in 1944, 1945, and goes off to MIT. Jim Stoms follows. Jim didn't join the Army. He had his own career as a Marine. He ends up at MIT too. And there's a story, one of the earliest stories that Jerry Keuper told me was about graduate school. We were talking one day about where you went to graduate school then. And he and a young nurse that he'd met, Natalie Keuper, head off to drive across the continent. What better way to know the place? Except he bought a car that periodically broke down. And he'd been accepted at Caltech, and he got there, and the term had already started. And so he said, is there any other school in California that starts later? And at that point, Stanford started a week later. He said, we'll go up to Palo Alto, and he makes his master's degree. I imagine it must have been interesting to go to Stanford and to see this young man walk in and say, I'm a physicist, and physicists can do anything. So maybe, and then after that master's degree at Stanford, he comes back to the East and goes to the University of Virginia. It's an interesting connection there. He did his PhD under Professor Jesse Beams. And those of you who know about cyclotrons and about linear electron accelerators may know the name Beams because he was one of the most notable figures in the development of those two apparati and worked and did a number of very, very important experiments. It was recognized later by Lyndon Johnson as one of the premier physicists in the country. And while he's at Virginia, he meets another guy. And we should spend an evening talking about this guy. His name is John Miller. And the two of them become fast friends. And as friends, they did lots of things together. There was dancing. And I even recall at one point President Keuper saying there was actually some imbibbing of alcoholic beverages. But whatever the case, these two individuals were fast friends. Keuper gets his PhD a year before John Miller and takes a job with Remington Arms in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And Miller, when he graduates, takes a job at Clemson as an academic, a physicist. Now, the figure Jim Stoms that I mentioned before, the chum, is critical to our being here tonight because Stoms had taken a job at what was then called the Missile Test Project. And he would write these letters. Jim Stoms is one of the heroes of my life. We were very close friends from the very beginning of my arrival here in Florida. And Jim told me about how he would write to Jerry Keuper, particularly when he would see in the press a description of bad weather. He would write that, here I am in Florida, I hope you're enjoying falling down in the snow. And that kind of schadenfreude that we do all enjoy so much. Well, Jim spotted an opportunity. And Jerry Keuper came down for an interview in 1957. Stayed out with the Stoms, who lived out on the beaches. Offered a job, but decided not to take it. And then went back to Connecticut, and he was driving a 1952 MG, which became Florida Institute of Technology for a while. He was driving, and they hit a snowdrift, and the car was turned over. And what Jerry Keuper said to me was, at that point I said, Natalie, we're moving to Florida. And that's why on that day, the 29th of January, 1958, Natalie Keuper, Melanie Keuper, Jerry Keuper, and 52 MG made their way into Florida. Now, Keuper told me, and Stoms confirmed this, that very, very early in that February, that Jerry Keuper began talking about, we need a place. We don't want this Melbourne to turn into the Kitty Hawk of rocketry. Great scientific endeavors are always connected with colleges and universities. So we've got to do something about this. And Madge Stoms said to Jerry Keuper, Jerry, don't you get Jim involved in any of your nefarious plans. Madge knew Jerry Keuper. People shoot rockets off in their backyards and build basements. They're dangerous people. And so the nefarious activity began to be planned. They met in those kinds of places. Always conspiracies are hatched. The Pelican Bar on the corner of O'Galley and A1A. The Merrimack Bar, which is between, it's no longer extant, was between the Melbourne Causeway and the O'Galley Causeway. And there this kind of cabal began to plan and think about what would be done. Donya Dixon, who was a mathematician, George Peters, Robert Kelly, and Harold Dibble. And they talked about doing and starting a school. Now, the interesting thing about this was nothing changes. They had no money. They had no money at all. But they had this idea that we can start this place. So one of the things that Jerry Keuper did is, I'll go to the Chamber of Commerce and get their support for this. So he goes to the Chamber of Commerce and says, will you support? The Chamber of Commerce said, no. So then he says, well, we'll organize a cotillion on the 6th of June in 1958 at the Trade Winds Hotel, a little bit of Waikiki in Atlantic is how it was built. They held an engineer's cotillion. There's a picture, I think, in the little book of all these gentlemen standing in white jackets, but the backstory is even better. The manager was a guy named Tom Doherty. And what happened shortly before the actual festivities began was Jerry Keuper began to note the hors d'oeuvres. He said, we're absolutely ridiculous. I pay some money for these things. So he went to Doherty and said, this is, you can't give people food like this. And Doherty said, you are insulting my hors d'oeuvres. And Keuper said, I'm not insulting, I'm not going to eat them. And so Doherty invited Jerry Keuper on the night of our first university function to step outside and settle this as gentlemen. And as Jerry Keuper walked out, and there's a lesson in this for all of us, and as a young professor when this story was told to me, I got the message well. Someone whispered in Jerry Cooper's ear, Doherty was a championship boxer. At that point, Jerry Keuper said, we need to reconsider this Maduro question. And so there was no fist fight at the beginning of the university. We say that for faculty meetings decades later. Engineers Cotillion raised enough money, about $35, to publish our first little advertisement that classes would begin in September. On the 18th of September, Keuper, who was with the Systems Analysts Division of RCA, organized a faculty meeting. The faculty meetings were held at Henschel's Red Rooster Restaurant. You can still drive by Henschel's Red Rooster Restaurant. It's no longer a Red Rooster Restaurant. It's where Babcock Street connects into US 1. It's now a music display area. And so there the faculty meetings are. And Keuper announced, a couple of things. One of them was that there would be periodic meetings where the faculty would get together and talk about the students. Another was, and this becomes a kind of motif, that any administrator that ever lied to a faculty member would be fired. My God, that's an idea. This man over here, they're truthful individuals, but on occasion, I think I've had what I would call as Pinocchio moments with some of my superiors, in which they would ask me things like, are you comfortable with this? Hell, if I was comfortable with it, I wouldn't be doing it. I mean, that was usually whatever. And so they had the first faculty meeting. The next night, they had their first organizational meeting of the 154 students, all of them missile men, and that's a generic term. There were 6 women in that initial group. They held their meeting in one of the 3 rented classrooms in O'Galley Junior High School, which is now West Shore. You can see some of the same buildings over there by the branch courthouse. Here's the problem. No money. Keuper is introduced to the students as the president by, I believe, Robert Kelly. One of the students yells out, hell, he's the guy that sold us my pencils. The problem Keuper told me about was they had no money to get the books. The books had been sent COD, McGraw-Hill and Prentice. Fortunately, McGraw-Hill allowed them to take a few of the books, so they had the shuttle service back and forth to the O'Galley post office. They'd sell a book, take the money back to buy other books, and back and forth. On Monday, the 22nd of September, 1958, our university held its first classes. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday nights, 3 hours, 7 to 10, one class, $35, $2.66, 3 for $94. It's a bargain if you take more classes. And Keuper had a policy that went from the very beginning that classes would not be canceled for any reason, because people had paid good money for this thing. Well, that's not exactly true. Classes were always canceled when there was a launch, because everybody involved in the university was a missile. So our university had the distinction of being the place when not only were skyrockets shut off, but rockets were shut off. We closed. The stories, there's lots of stories in that first year. One of the things that we celebrate, and I thank President Catanese for doing this, is every year in January we recognize Julius Montgomery. President Catanese created this award for Julius Montgomery, who was one of a handful of African-American students who in our second semester, actually second quarter, it was discovered by the Brevard school system that we had a handful of African-American students. And the superintendent of schools said, we are a segregated school system, you'll have to kick those kids out or we're going to evict you from the classroom. And Julius Montgomery came with one of his colleagues and said, we will voluntarily step down if you make the promise that when you are in a facility of your own that we can return. We completed that year, and as Jerry Keuper said, if those 2 men hadn't shown that courage and resolve, this university would not exist today. The next fall, we were kicked out. Homer Denius and George Shaw, who had their own trouble here in Melbourne, they had to start their own bank because nobody would lend them any money, held the deed for what was an old church. It's the Methodist Church. It had moved, and so we moved to the Methodist Church on Strawbridge, and Julius Montgomery began to take classes again. The roof fell in. on that Methodist church. I don't know if it was God's way of saying we needed to move to another place, but it didn't. But Jerry Keuper noted that the Beaumark rocket engine cases, which were our first physics lab table, they survived. And we moved those lab tables to our third home, which was a building out on the old Indian River Naval Air Station, called Building Number 1 for Radiation, where we held our second year of classes. And then, in 1960, one of the few people in the Chamber of Commerce, a man named Norman Lund, who was the manager of Melbourne Village, came to Jerry Keuper and said, we may have a possibility for you. There's this 35 acres that something called the University of Melbourne has attempted to start a program on. There was one little building. It's now our human resources. And if you make us a commitment to preserve the botanical garden, I've got several wonderful documents about that Jerry Keuper talked about, gave me. We think we'll let you use that on the basis of $1 rent for 40 years. Eventually, it becomes ours with 130 plus acres of land. And we moved here, and to celebrate that, Keuper said we're going to organize a party for the city mothers and fathers of Melbourne, our city council, and they invited them all to come to what is now, as I said, our human resources little building. And as Jerry Keuper said, yet another stunning failure. No one except a drunk showed up. And he didn't even know why he was there. So in the beginning, one would say that the sense of accolades from the Melbourne community for this rising star was somewhat eclipsed by the fact that a lot of folks had their hands over their eyes and could not believe you could start a school in this way. And why is it called? And you know, some of you do know this. It was called Brevard Engineering College. The reason for that was that when Keuper was driving down on that station wagon was a parking sticker that he had from teaching at Bridgeport Engineering Institute. He did that as well as working at the Remington Arms, which is part of DuPont. And he said, well, heck, I'll just call it Brevard Engineering Institute. I won't have to change my parking sticker. As I think President Catanese will affirm, one's tenure as a president has to do with a good football team and parking places. And parking stickers are very powerful. And so when the students said at that very first meeting, we don't want to be an institute, we want to be a college, Keuper took a razor and took the I off and put a C in, and there you go. That's pluck, that's energy, that's changing things. The school was really, we didn't have a full-time employee until 1962, when a guy named Tom Putnam, story unto himself, becomes our first full-time employee. And then Denton Clark, who was one of our founding trustees, went on to become vice president for RCA Canada. Denton Clark went to Jerry Keuper and said, you know, you really, in essence, need to devote yourself full-time to this. And so with only less than 5 years at RCA, Jerry Keuper took the plunge, and in 1963 came over and began a full-time career. And this is a very interesting moment, because the shifts at the Cape were a night shift, and then there was an 11 to 7 in the morning shift, and they had a couple of classes at 8 and 9 in the morning. And Keuper made the decision in 1963 to make this into a residential, full-time college. And our very first year, we had 15 students, and the majority of them came from New Jersey, one particular high school. So Keuper told me he had this drill. He would have Tom Putnam call up the high school counselor and say, I have the president of Brevard Engineering College on the line. Could you speak to the counselor, please? And then Jerry Keuper would be like, this is the president. We have some wonderful students here. We'd like to have them. And he found a way to begin to get counselors who had an aptitude and an appetite for science and mathematics and engineering to begin to funnel these bright young people to the campus. And so by 1964, we built our first dormitory, Brownlee Hall. And after that, we began to move. In 1964, a young assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh moved down here and went to work for RCA. His name was Harry Weber. In 1966, Harry Weber became a full-time member of the Florida Institute of Technology. We became Florida Institute of Technology in 1965. Became a full-time member of that. A week later, a guy named, I think you heard his name, John Miller showed up. And the two of them became the co-conspirators in the development of a vigorous academic program. John Miller was a remarkable guy. In some ways, John Miller and Jerry Keuper were very much alike, and in other ways they were very different. John Miller deserves tremendous credit as the academic engine of coming with Harry Weber and saying, we've got to get our undergraduate major in electrical engineering now. We need to develop a master's degree program. We need a PhD program. What do we need to do these things? When I met John Miller said to me, Patterson, he didn't call me Pal, he was my name. Patterson, the drill here is not ready, fire, aim. Get it in the right order. And that's good advice of an administrator to a young faculty member. And so in 1966, you've got Harry Weber here, and you've got John Miller, and then they lure this innocent Catholic boy who'd shared an office with Harry Weber at the University of Pittsburgh. I don't know what vitamins Andy Rive takes, but he looks very much like what he did 35 years ago. Lured Andy Rive down here. And Andy came driving onto campus in one of the stories, and his wife Suzanne, he goes, where is the campus? And it was like so many things at Florida Tech. The campus was somewhere up here. In fact, I'll tell you this is a little off-color story, but it's an interesting one. We faced an accreditation challenge. We were a group, Jerry Keuper had almost all of the PhDs at Cape teaching. There's no doubt about that. But to get accredited, you needed SACS, Southern Association of Colleges approval. The director of SACS was a guy named Gordon Sweet. He came down here and said, there's no way you're going to be accredited. You can't be accredited. You don't have a library. Well, that's not entirely correct. One day at that radiation building, number 1, Keuper was walking through it, and there's a woman who's full of the books, and he said, who are you? And she said, I am the librarian. My name is Eileen Hall, and you must always watch out for librarians, because Eileen Hall became the first librarian in Florida Institute. But we didn't have a library to speak of. So, in 1963, Keuper learns from one of the people, Jack Pettigrew, that Nelson Rockefeller was in Miami. So let's just go down there and talk to Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller's got a lot of money. We can do this. So they drive down there and they go see Rockefeller, and for some reason Rockefeller doesn't give them, a sack of money, but they walk to the marina in Miami Beach, and they're walking along, and they see on this yacht a couple of women, they're twins, lying sunbathing, and Keuper begins talking about rockets and the university. And they drive back, and Keuper said, we didn't get Rockefeller, we got a couple of blondes, because one of the blondes was the divorced wife of a gold mine owner who was one of the richest men in California, also had some oil wells, and he had convinced her that she should, now that her husband had passed away, he did die in January of 1964, that she should give money to form the William Bartholomew Library, which is now the Keuper Administration Room. So, Gordon Sweet from SACS shows up. Keuper has got the foundation laid. There's nothing in the... And Keuper begins talking about this library that's going to be built there. And at the end of the conversation, Sweet looks up and sees this blue sky and says, I see a magnificent library with people studying here and working. The 60s, people did lots of drugs. And so the libraries, but here's the problem. Mrs. Bartholomew didn't give the money. And it kept going. And one day, this is the delightful story that ends this, One day, Jerry Keuper gets a call to come to California to the Diamond Estate, as it was called, where Mrs. Barthon was going to organize this party. And so he shows up there, and Werner von Braun is there. And he thinks, well, Werner von Braun had been one of our first commencement speakers. I think his robe is hanging over there. This is it. Around the pool, the money that is going to be presented to. There were libations, drinking. Werner von Braun, apparently from what Jerry Keuper said, his inertial guidance system was not working as well at the end of the evening. And then two of the gentlemen, a physicist will even help a German rocket launcher, they wandered upstairs and they wandered into the wrong bedroom. They got out of that bedroom. And the next day, Jerry Keuper told me that apparently a young actor had felt he'd been insulted by the pool and threatened litigation. His name was, I think it was Robert Redford. And Keuper left without a penny. That's not a problem. I don't think our library is called the William Barthon Library. We got up there on the ladder, took the name off the library and said, money for the things, we'll get the name on that. Thankfully, John Evans, very honorable man, good man, leaves a behest which becomes this library that we're in today. The other story that I think is worth your attention is Jerry Keuper suffered from a serious disease. It's called palmitis. Palmitis. Palmitis is a disease in which you find an unusual compulsion to connect with palm trees. And the problem was that once we got this land, it didn't look very good. It had some scrubby pines on it, and it had this low wetland area. And so Keuper said, I want this place to look grand, so I'll get a bunch of royal palms and put them along a country club, and then, of course, in 1962, there was a freeze, and they all died, except for one. So he said, I need to learn something about this. And he discovered there was a man named Dent Smith. He was a stockbroker who retired living in Dayton Beach. He goes there, and Dent Smith begins to talk to him about these palm trees and things. And that's when the first signs of palmitis began to show. So he began to get interested in it. This is the thing about Jerry Keuper. I think that anybody that knew him, you could see in his eyes a kind of inquisitiveness. That if something interested him, he grabbed hold of it. 7 to 8 MGs that he would build from scratch, the fragments found in the field, palm trees, and so they begin this process of it. And on weekends, I don't know if Natalie went along on these, but I know that once Mrs. Keuper, Natalie Keuper, told me about a story of driving down in a truck, picking up palm trees in Miami, driving back. In one instance, this is a good one, you're going to get some palms in Fort Lauderdale. So he rented on Friday this flatbed truck, got a faculty member to come along with him, drove down to Fort Lauderdale, loaded the truck up, and they're driving down the road, and a police car makes a U-turn and pulls up behind him. Policeman says, how come you didn't dim your lights? Keuper said, I didn't know they were on the bright. Let me see your driver's license. Ooh, driver's license expired. What are you? I'm a rocket scientist. So Keuper is now locked up in the Fort Lauderdale. He's in this cell. It's about midnight. And this very large, as Jerry Keuper described, trustee came and said, come, Jerome. Keuper told me that he thought he was going to meet his maker at that point, or he was going to make a lot of friends, or he was going to have to stand and deliver an awfully good explanation. The police chief was there, said, do you know anybody here? And at that point, it's another story. I wrote an article about it. Our university flirted with the idea of becoming Florida Christian University. The Disciples of Christ had been put in million. They didn't give up $1 million. We're not Florida Christian University. But a reverend from Fort Lauderdale was one of the negotiators. And so at 2 o'clock in the morning, Jerry Keuper called the one person in Fort Lauderdale who knew the Reverend Updike, and Mrs. Updike answered the phone. And he said, this is Jerry Keuper. I've got a little problem. And Mrs. Updike said, it is such an honor that you called us up. And by God, got him off. I don't know, palm trees were driven down. He did get a little bit of a ticket, and he had to go back then with a new driver's license, because the driver's license had been canceled. And so that began this marvelous moving of up to 200 different species of palm trees. I found an article just 2 weeks ago that I passed to our horticulturist, Holly Chichester, which describes in 1975 the story of, the potential and some of the things that were happening there in the garden. And by the time that garden was developing, a young civil engineer named Ed Kalajian had joined the faculty, working in oceanography and civil engineering. A man named George Webster had launched, John Miller, it was his idea of launching a biology department, and then the idea of a science education program. And Keuper had the vision to realize by '68, there's an interesting little piece that he wrote in the, I believe, Melbourne Tribune, in which he wrote that there's no plan for a post-Apollo. There's no plan for a post-Apollo project. We've got to widen our curriculum and find ways to make our university relevant to the next stage in the development of science, technology, engineering. We did STEM before STEM had been thought of. And so this sense of opportunity and finding and opening, that's one of the things that I come away from when I think about Jared Keuper. Jim Stoms and Jared Keuper were really men cut from a different kind of cloth than most of us. They were individuals who had a passion, had an appetite, had an energy, who could tell a tall tale, who could sometimes work a con, and other times do things very, 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 very amazing. Because they dreamed, and they had a vision, and they had courage, and they had intelligence. Years later, in 1996, after President Keuper retired, I was asked by Lynn Weaver to meet with him at 8 o'clock in the morning on a cold January day by the old schoolhouse. And he told me, Gordon, I need you to show some people around campus, but I can't tell you their names, and I can't tell you why they're here, but you're going to meet them, and I want you to. So I got out there, and I had the New York Times, and I'm sitting there on a cold day. And the man came up, and President Weaver said to me, "This is Bill, and Larry." Bill and Larry just standing there for her. Turned out it was the representatives of the Pullman Foundation. And what we talked about was looking at that schoolhouse, which was built in the 1880s by Richard Good. And it was the first place that people went to school here. And the people who made, I told the Olin Foundation, the people who made the 20th century went to school in buildings that looked like that. The people that are going to define the 21st century go to schools that look like this. And that Jerry Keuper and Harry Weber and Andy Reeve and John Miller and Ed Kalajian and Bob Frank and a whole lot of other men and women that it's been my privilege to know had a vision, had the intelligence, had the courage, had what I would call the chutzpah to step forward and say, this is just an enlarged crawl space. This is what we do at a party. We shoot off rockets. On my 25th wedding anniversary, Jared Keuper lent me that 1952 MG. And Joy was taking a class in Bob Frank. And I pulled up by the first building that was built after Brevard Engineering, the college engineering. And Joy came out, and I honked the horn, and I said, "Let's go for a ride." And then the water pump went out. And I called Jared Keuper and said, "I'll come right over and fix it." That's a different kind of guy. And he did. And now I've been married 44 years. And I credit Jared Keuper with perhaps giving me that next 19 because you can't take your wife out on a date on their 25th wedding anniversary in a broken car. And we drove it around, and it was splendid. At the end of Jared Keuper's career, he turned himself back to his first passion, which was Chinese. And this is this book that he and one of our great faculty members, Jundalin, just a marvelous man. Jundalin helped Jerry with some of this. And there's a lot of really, really wonderful idioms in this. I mean, if you want to learn to curse in Chinese, powerful. But this particular phrase, liao bu de, which means amazing, wonderful, marvelous, wow, gosh. Liao bu de, Florida Institute of Technology, Liao bu de. One of the stories, and I'll end with this note because Harry Weber's got some stories that will cause my beard to get One of the things that I think about when I look at our university is a passage from the German philosopher Nietzsche. And Nietzsche says, and my wife and I put this on a bench that's between the freshman dormitories and campus. Nietzsche says in a book called Morgenröte, which means dawn, the most common form of stupidity, is to forget your purpose. The most common form of stupidity is to forget your purpose. Jerry Keuper, John Wood, Harry Weber, Andy Newman, Ed Kalajian, Bob Clark, Anthony Catanese have not forgotten the purpose of this institution. We are lifting young men and women. We are teaching them, we're giving them opportunities. Long may our university remain wise. Liao bu de. We have a marvelous second floor renovation that Sonia Bostoni orchestrated and done up there. It is just amazing. And this is a wonderful bit of technology which has got an iPad on it with a small robot and it wheels and you can interact with people and do things. And in December, one of Ed Kalajian and my favorite students, Ayman Sherry from Egypt, civil engineer, came and we were thinking about what shall we call these robots that move around campus on wheels? And so we decided, let's call them the Jerrys. So Jerry's going to be with us in this way, not necessarily with a photograph. So the Jerry's out here today. And this, of course, is the signature which Bob Frank has spent the last 6 weeks learning how to digitize. I use this kind. And so meet Jerry. Watch out. He will roll over you if you get in his way.
While you all are finding your tickets, I am going to just have a few remarks. We really can't let the evening go by without recognizing just a few more people, if I may. First of all, I would like to, I have no permission to do this, so excuse me. Dr. Gordon Patterson's mother is in the house. So if she could just wave at us, we're very happy you did what you did. Where are you? There she is. Angel, remain standing just for a moment, Angel. Angel in the back is the creator of the clip of video that's playing in our second floor digital scholarship lab. Also, we have with us this evening one of our most wonderful supporters at the Evans Library of our Ed Skellings Special Collections, Dr. Louise Skellings. Would you wave at us? Where are you, Louise? There you are. And there are people in this room who have known the Keupers back when they lived in Connecticut. Do I have that right? If you all would just admit it, right? Just wave your hands so we can see. I can only imagine they have stories to tell that we would all love to hear. Okay, so let's get going on our drawing. Everybody has a ticket in here, right? Okay. Okay, Dr. Catanese, would you kindly?
Of course.
All right, last three numbers, 642, 647, 642.
Okay, looks like, oh, good. You have a very cool name. Yes, what is your first name? Priscilla, yes, Priscilla. Priscilla Kalajian. Here you go, and I'd like you to open this if you would, please. We love a theme around firearms. Okay, here we go. Isn't that cool paper? It's Terry Keuper gift wrap. Yes. Terry Cooper's on. Want some of that?
All right, while we're recognizing some folks in the audience, I would like to just recognize here in the front row here, you've heard her name mentioned, the daughter of President Keuper, Melanie Keuper, and the granddaughter of President Keuper, Amber Keuper. And since we're talking about presidents, we also have our current president sitting in the front row here, Dr. Anthony Catanese. This thing freaks me out, I'm sorry. I mentioned when I first came here, shortly after I got here, I was called into the dean's office, and I want to tell you a little bit more about that event now in introducing our next person. I was called into the dean's office, and I went into the dean's office, sat down, and the door closed behind me, and he started explaining to me about the situation we were in and why I was going to take over as acting department head. And then there was a knock on the door, and the secretary said, "I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I know, sir, that you need to take this call. This is a phone call you've been waiting for." So I said, "Do you want me to leave?" And he said, No, you stay right here. So he picked up the phone and was very engrossed into talking with whoever it was on the other end of the phone. And at that time, I don't know whether he still does, but at that time he smoked cigars a lot. And so he had a cigar going on his desk, and he was really engrossed in this phone conversation. And he, without really looking, he was on the phone, took the cigar and tipped the ashes into the wastebasket behind him. And I thought at the time, well, he's the dean, I guess he can do that. And I know this phone call is important until I started seeing wisps of smoke coming out of the can there. And I thought, I probably ought to say something. So I, and pointed back there. And you couldn't smell it because his office reeked of cigar smoke. You couldn't smell it. And so he turned around and saw these whiffs of smoke coming up there. Apparently it was at least a small piece of paper in there. And so he slammed the phone down on the desk and cursed. And I've always wondered who the person on the other end, what they thought at the time. And he took the trash can, the wastebasket, and shook it up a little bit, and then set it back down. Took a couple legal pads off of his desk, put them on top to smother it, and then went back to talking with this person on the phone. And I thought, yeah, okay, this is a man who knows how to put out fires. Probably a really good dean. And he then went on to the vice president for academic affairs at FIT. He came here, as has already been stated, exactly 50 years ago in 1966. And when he retired, he came back here because he decided that we really needed a university archive. And we had had a lot of papers and a lot of material that had been collected over the years, but nobody had really really decided to coordinate efforts to put all of these things in an archive. So he took it on himself to raise some money from some of the alums that he knew and get the whole idea of a university archive started. And as a result of that, we now have the Harry P. Weber University Archives. One room is just right around the corner here, and if you haven't been in that room, by all means, see that room. There are also a number of other rooms that make up the archive. And we also have a full-time archivist on campus here, and this is all due to the efforts of Harry Weber. So with that, it's a great honor for me to introduce to you Professor Emeritus Dr. Harry Weber.
First, let me express my deep appreciation for being asked to participate in channeling Jerry Keuper. What I say now will probably be the first of two serious remarks that I make during this presentation. I was in my teens during World War II and would agree with Tom Brokaw, who wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. Thinking of it makes me almost cry. Both Jerry Keuper and John Miller, my boss, during my tenure at FIT, are part of that generation, and they both have my deepest admiration. I have been asked to present some anecdotes which involve Jerome and Keuper. During my employment at FIT, I devoted most of my time to academic matters and administration. However, tonight I will discuss some events which I hope will result in passing humor along to you and show that we are all very human. I hope you won't mind if I first take a crack at myself with some quickies. The compliment. Question mark after that. With a question mark, John Miller once commented, "In my presence, I never heard that anyone said when they came out of Harry Weber's office, 'What did he mean by that?'" I took this as a compliment. I leave it to you to decide whether or not. There were three beloved women in my life. The first was obviously my mother, Anna. The second was my wife, Marilyn. And the third, much to your surprise, was my mother-in-law. Now, I titled this event, "The Prophetic Pronouncement." The second incident occurred when I met my wife of 64 years, Marilyn. The gang was partying at a friend's house in the basement lounge, which his father had constructed. Marilyn came down the steps. Remember, this was the first time I met her. And met me for the first time. She was 17 years old and I was 19. When she went home that night, she said to her mother, and I quote, "I met the most disgusting boy." Her mother's reply was simply, uh-oh. With these simple words, she had made a prophetic pronouncement. Marilyn and I were married a little over a year later. Now on to Jerome Penn Keuper. Short narratives of some things that happened at FIT, which I was personally aware of, and which always didn't turn out exactly as we wanted them to. I have titled them Copernicus, Keuper, Pretentious Peacocks, Flag Fury, and Crawford Compromise. First, Copernicus, Keuper. FIT joined an organization called the Florida-Columbia Alliance, wherein the state of Florida would cooperate with Columbia in matters of mutual interest. On several occasions, John Miller and I accompanied Jerry on trips to Columbia. On our way to Cartagena, from Bogota, we stopped at a very nice ranch in a town called Ibagué. We were served hors d'oeuvres, which were hard-boiled eggs from a bird called Copernicus quail. Now, they were served on a toothpick. This delicacy aroused Jerry's enterprising spirit. Jerry decided that he would market Copernicus quail eggs in the United States. Somehow or other, knowing Jerry, he would get things done. Somehow or other, he got the quail, housed them over behind the gymnasium in a coop, which he had constructed in an existing building, and a young lady was hired to feed and care for them. They produced very small eggs. Jerry had them hard-boiled, had cartons made for their market. We all know that Jerry was excellent in selling an idea. That was one of his strong points. He convinced the local public market manager that they were a marketable product. After about 3 months, the preliminary sales results were in. Needless to say, they revealed that we were not going to make a boomtown of Noble with quail eggs for nerves. To worsen matters considerably, the quail were besieged with a lice invasion. The lice were an itchy hazard to humans in entering the coop. The revealing sales figure and the nasty lice caused the quail to miraculously evaporate. And we closed out the Copernicus Cape. Now on to the pretentious peacocks. What makes these humorous is that we were all involved, and they didn't turn out exactly the way we wanted them to turn out. The pretentious peacocks. People who have a casual relation with FIT are aware that we have a superb botanical gardens. To add some life to the gardens, Jerry decided to import the beautiful birds known as peacocks. While they were beautiful birds, he apparently was not aware that they had some idiosyncrasies. Number one, they would be awfully squawking, noisy at times, particularly when they were in the mating season. And they were known to wander from their normal habitat. Now to Harry. Since I was dean of most of the academic programs on campus, other than the School of Aeronautics, out of ordinary calls would sometimes get directed to me, as I knew the right people to call. Mrs. Jablonski, my secretary, received a call from the police department of Melbourne, which she passed on to me. They informed me that our peacocks were on Babcock Street and were raising havoc with the automobile traffic. I accepted the challenge of the wandering peacocks and called Dale Simcox. He expressed to me that Jerry was explicit when he told him that the peacocks were the president's responsibility. Jerry didn't want anybody fooling him. However, Dale, gracious as always, agreed to handle the matter. A month or so later, I received another call from the police department. The message was the same, but somewhat more emphatic. People who work with me know that at times I have a deadly spirit. I was still on the phone. I thought, how could I use this talent of mine to solve the problem? The thought came to me from what Dale Simcox had said. These are not my peacocks, they are President Keuper's. Eureka. I respectfully told the person on the phone that they would definitely get action from the president and directed them to Jerry's extension. I don't know what happened after that, but in less than a month, the precocious peacocks miraculously wandered away and tranquility was restored to the campus. Now, one in which I was personally involved, Flag Fury. During the Vietnam War, it was common for some students to demonstrate against Americans involved. John Middle and I were in President Keuper's office when this incident occurred. About 100 students from Brevard Community College were on our campus and in a peaceful demonstration had lowered our flag at half-mast. They were standing around the flagpole, sometimes showing signs, talking, and sometimes singing a little. To me, there didn't seem to be any danger of unpleasantness, but Jerry's unnegotiable position was only the President of the United States could authorize the lowering of our flag to half-mast. After several visits to view what was going on out there, he was convinced that they were not going to go away. And he expressed his position again. He additionally added that this is private property and they must put up that flag and leave peacefully. He was right. Now the punchline. Jerry turns to me, looks me in the eye, and says, Harry, I want you to get down there and tell them so. Cooperation is one thing, danger is another. I remained silent, hoping for an out. John Miller finally pulled my bacon out of the fire and suggested to Jerry that this was a matter of our security. Jerry then realized that this was not a job for Harry Weber, but for our security. He called their office and they came over, discussed the matter with the group, and they left peacefully. Our security raised the flag at the top of the pole. Jerry had won as the flag fury was over. We both were relieved. I do believe that I was more relieved than Jerry. Finally, one more incident. This involved John Miller, Jerry, and me. The Crawford Compromise. The Crawford Science Building location had been selected, and the final plans for its construction were presented for Jerry's approval. John Miller and I had discussed the orientation of the building on several occasions. The plan showed the stairwell on the east side of the building. That means the building would be turned on around 180 degrees from what it is now, and the offices on the west side. John approached Jerry with our view that the building should be turned around and the offices be on the east side as we get the sun in the morning and a grand view of the lagoon in the day. Now, if the stairwell was on the west side, the afternoon sun would be heating the stairwell. Additionally, the view from there was not anything spectacular. John approached Jerry with our suggestion, and the answer was a flat no. Apparently, John persisted with our argument. After all, we were to be defense of the building. One day, when we had finished the meeting with Jerry, he called John and me aside. His terse but emphatic comment was, "We have decided to turn the building around." His final shot, which I distinctly remember, was, "I don't want to hear any more from you two about this building." Naturally, Dawn and I complied with his final statement as we were going away, pleased with Jerry's Crawford compromise. In summary, this is the other serious thing I'm going to say. In summary, there was never a day that I came to work that I didn't enjoy myself. There are instances where things didn't work out exactly as FIT staff had planned, but in reality, we all tried like hell. And I am very proud of our results. This tenacious persistence is what started FIT on the road to success. I must say that from my viewpoint, this same road to success is being traveled by the succeeding presidents. I close these remarks with our sincere congratulations to them and their staff. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry. Thanks a lot. That concludes our program here, but be sure and, as I reminded you before, to, if you have the time, to check out some of the cabinets here. And I would just like to give a special thanks to Kathy Turner. She's the one who said. I hope you have a good evening, have a safe trip home, and thank you all for coming.